So with that, I will turn towards my colleague Ryan. Ryan has a fantastic experience in managing the large deployment of infrastructure. So what are some of the challenges, Ryan, that you see when you're looking at such a large critical infrastructure deployed at such a large scale and with such a fast pace? So what are those challenges that you can help and share with us?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. So first of all, thank you for having me. And secondly, I think we could probably have a panel just about this one topic itself. So I'll try and cover this at a pretty high level, but if any of you want to find me after the session, I'm happy to talk about it in more detail. I think there's a couple of assumptions we have to make before we dive into this. One of them is that 5G is going to drive an increase in the number of physical devices on the network. And by that, I don't just mean handsets. I mean physical IP-consuming devices that are sitting behind hotspots and FWA CPE. And I think we also have to assume that generally over time, the bandwidth consumption profile of all these devices is going to go up, right? So if we assume all these things are true, then I think there's three key areas we have to think about. The first one is edge computing. And I know we talk about edge computing all the time, and it's this, sort of amorphous concept that is different on an industry by industry basis. But let me give you an example of a place where I think this has a meaningful impact in the 5G world. So let's say that you as an operator want to go train an AI, right? And you want to use, anonymized, tokenized data from your user base to be able to do that. Moving that data around, especially to a data center where you've got your training farm, has an implicit cost in your infrastructure, right? So being able to anonymize and tokenize and summarize that data closer to the edge has meaningful benefits in, the TTL of your, let's say, your backhaul and connectivity infrastructure. So that's one piece of it. The second is capacity, right? And this is one that has so many dimensions, it's almost incomprehensible. The first one is, if you're going to do edge computing, where do you put the compute and how much can you put there, right? Some of these cell sites, if that's where you're putting it, you may not have a ton of space and power to be able to accommodate growth. So understanding what your strategy is, when you're capacity constrained, what actions do you take? Do you deploy and then undeploy services based on what's relatively available? Thinking through your responses to those kinds of constraint scenarios, I think, is really critical before you dive into that end of the pool. The other is the physical network capacity itself, right? I could talk about RAN capacity. Actually, I couldn't because I'm not really a radio guy. I'm sure everyone else in this room could probably talk about RAN capacity planning better than I could. But then there's the backhaul piece, right? But we have to think more longitudinally about capacity. Don't just think about backhaul and RAN. Think about your edge, your aggregation layer. Think about your core. Think about your NNI edge, right, with all your peering and transit partners. 5G has the capability to more rapidly and more severely impact your overall capacity utilization profile more quickly than previous technologies, right? So being able to quickly respond to capacity demands in all those dimensions of your network are really, really, really important, right? How quickly can you add capacity with a peer? Do you know the answer to that question, right? You probably should, right? And if you've got hundreds of peers, being able to address each one of those needs independently is pretty critical. And then the last is the operations and maintenance piece of this. So, you assume you get this network deployed. It's large and complicated and has a ton of utilization on it, and you have to go do work. You have to add capacity or do upgrades or change devices. Your goal should be to, decrease the scope of the widget you need to touch to the smallest possible piece, right? Like if you can disaggregate your hardware and your software, that means that you can touch those two pieces of your infrastructure independently without having to interact with a single supply chain. You can interact with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And then if you think about the compute side of things, a microservices approach I think is pretty critical, right? The thought of having to reimage a server every time you want to go deploy a new service in your edge computing infrastructure is sort of crazy, right? What you want to do is destroy a container and recreate it. So being able to address those compute needs in a microservices way, I think is critical. And then last is be open. Locking yourself into proprietary technology just means that you're locking yourself into fewer options with regard to software and supply chain and all these different things that are relatively open and mature today, right? So use those technologies where they make sense for you, and I think you'll end up with a much more scalable and smooth deployment experience over time. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ryan. So before I move, I think I just wanted to cover another aspect. You talk about data and you talk about data anonymization. I think one of the other important aspect which is coming when you talk about the data is there's the amount of data that you capture, which is fine. You're looking for uh, taking the services, you have to provide certain information, and that's the data. And I'm primarily focusing on the personal data. But there's a huge amount of data which is getting generated, right? And that obviously is the new oil that we talk about, the data which is generated. And there's amount of data which is getting inferred as well. So how do you manage that? And it obviously depends on the complexity of the use cases. But that's another important aspect, and it's again impacting the deployment of 5G, or more not as a technology, as a service, when you're talking about the use cases and keeping the cybersecurity aspect around that. So we'll cover that, but that's a very important aspect.